When he left Spain, Napoleon assured Joseph he would be back as soon as he had dealt with the Austrians. Furthermore, he made this grandiloquent announcement to the Corps Legislatif: "When I show myself beyond the Pyrenees, the terrified leopard will seek the ocean in order to avoid shame, defeat and death. The triumph of my arms will be the triumph of the spirit of good over that of evil." Yet he never went back to Spain and remained in France for over 2 years for no good reason while the military situation worsened. How is this to be explained? The usual answer provided is that he thought the Spanish theater secondary, and considered that the war there could be won whenever he chose to return. Superficially, too, the situation in Spain in the spring of R809 seemed much more promising. The English had been expelled, Madrid taken, and the siege of Zaragoza successfully completed after 40,000 casualties among the defenders. Yet there are grounds for believing the real explanation is in terms of Napoleon's own credibility. It seems unlikely, to say the least, that the problems of his army in Spain appeared mysterious to him. But how could he pull his forces out now and risk an unacceptable loss of prestige? Napoleon's problem was that he needed an immense army to subdue Spain, yet such an army could neither live off the land nor be supplied from France, because of the atrocious state of the roads across the Pyrenees. Even if he did manage to supply them, the drain on the French treasury would be unacceptable. Hitherto he had been able to pyramid his successes. Blitzkrieg warfare was followed by an orgy of looting, which in turn paid for further armies, further blitzkriegs, further loot, and so to the continuance of the cycle. But in Spain the French, instead of gaining some 250 million francs per successful battle, began to pour out blood and treasure, gaining nothing in return. There was no possibility of an Austerlitz. Seeing all this clearly, yet unable to withdraw for reasons of pride and prestige, Napoleon simply distanced himself from the campaign, as he had with the Vendée in 1795 and Egypt in 1798. Reasons of credibility ensured that the marshals would take the blame for a war that was in principle unwinnable. Yet if Napoleon had no intention of returning to Spain, the British certainly did. Wellesley returned to Portugal in April I-809 and began by defeating Soult at Oporto on I-May. On the 28th of July came the hard-fought Battle of Talavera, where Wellesley defeated Victor but not without cost, sustaining 0 casualties to the French 7-0. When Wellesley moved back into Portugal to head off another thrust from Soult, his Spanish allies complained vociferously that the British were abandoning them, just as Moore had allegedly done the year before. London, though, upheld Wellesley and created him Viscount Wellington for the success at Talavera. The Spanish were obliged to accept Wellington grudgingly as an informal supremo of the Allied forces. To deal with the triple threat of Wellington, Spanish regulars and the growing numbers of guerrillas, by the autumn of I-809 Napoleon had committed 350,000 troops to the peninsula. The Peninsular War has sometimes been written up as if it were an inevitable British response to Napoleon's continental blockade and his blundering into Spain. In fact, the decision to intervene in the Iberian Peninsula was a marginal one, for no vital British interests seemed involved there, unlike, say, the Baltic. Opponents of an expedition to Spain argued variously that the area did not pose an invasion threat, was not a source of vital imports, was not a link in the chain of command with other powers, and offered no barrier to French attacks in the Middle and Far East. Others argued that there could be important economic benefits, that even if Napoleon bought off or suborned his opponents in Northern Europe, Britain could still fight on in the South, and in some that a peninsular campaign made Britain independent of her allies. Initially, opportunism was the spur. It was an opportunity to strike at French naval power, for the 6 Franco-Spanish ships of the line that had huddled in Cadiz and Vigo since Trafalgar were taken out, as were all Portuguese warships. The Royal Navy also gained the use of the Atlantic ports of Lisbon and Oporto. Gradually, though, London became aware of other implications of the Spanish intervention. They could deny France the commerce of Latin America, which was why British policy shifted in these years from encouraging Latin American independence to keeping the colonies loyal to Spain, and by tying Napoleon up in Spain prevent him from making any moves against Canada and India. The conjectured economic benefits did materialize. In Spain, British exports rose from Ps. 0.7 million in I-807 to just over £6.7 million in I-809, and by I-812 Spain was taking 1/5 of British exports. Latin America, too, proved a cornucopia. A commercial treaty with Dom João in 1810 threw Brazil open to British trade, so that British exports to South America rose from £1.2 million in 1807 to £2.7 million in 1812. Most of all, the British could take independent action against Napoleon in Spain but not in the rest of the continent. until 1813. This enabled them to allay the suspicions of nations like Russia, who feared that Britain wanted to conduct the war against Napoleon on their backs, and also to shrug off requests for military aid, as from Russia in 1812 and Austria in 1813. Not coincidentally, Spain made Wellington's fame and fortune, especially after he was formally given the title of Commander-in-Chief in 1812, for if he had been able to campaign with Britain's allies in Northern Europe before 1815, he would have been merely another minor general. The Peninsular Campaign gave Britain an independent voice at later peace talks, a voice that would probably have been drowned by the Russians and Austrians had she committed her forces to Northern Europe. This explains why the British were always more lavish with subsidies in Spain than in other theaters of war. They began by giving the 5 leading juntas £1.1 million, with a promise of more once a supreme junta had been set up. Once this was done, in September 1, 808, a British envoy was sent to the peninsula with £6 shiro in silver and instructions to negotiate a commercial treaty covering Latin America. Altogether, £2.5 million in arms and money was sent to Spain in 1808, leading to severe specie shortages in England. This shortage was the principal reason why Britain could not take maximum advantage of Napoleon's embroilment with Austria in 1809. With the British fully engaged, the position of the French, committed to holding down all of Spain, quickly became untenable. To combat the threefold opposition of Wellington, the Spanish army and the guerrillas, the French could seldom field an army even 0,000 strong at the point of maximum danger, even with their vast numbers. Such it commanded 80,000 in Aragon and Catalonia. Joseph's personal corps in Madrid numbered 14,000. Another 60,000 were kept back to guard the Pyrenean passes and keep open the roads to Madrid and Salamanca, and a further 60,000 under Soult entered Andalusia in 1810, and became bogged down in a pointless siege of Cadiz. There were 3 separate enemy forces facing the French and there were 3 distinct phases of the Peninsular War which roughly corresponded with them. In 1808 the Spanish army enjoyed its one great triumph at Bailén, in the wake of the nationwide spontaneous uprisings. In the second phase of the war, roughly from 1809 to 1812, the campaign was mixed, part regular engagements involving Wellington and the British Expeditionary Force, part guerrilla warfare. In fact, Wellington got better cooperation from the guerrilla chiefs, terrorists and brigands as they were, than from the regular Spanish commanders who showed a cynical lack of interest in anything from the British except cash and free weaponry and ammunition. It was only in the final phase of the war, in Raid ICI 3, that Wellington was able to dovetail all 3 elements and use the guerrillas in a coordinated strategy. The problem for the French was that they could have defeated Wellington on his own or the guerrillas on their own, but they could not defeat both. 150 years later the Americans were to learn the same bloody lesson in Vietnam, that the combination of a regular army plus widespread guerrilla warfare and a hostile population made military occupation of a large country impossible. What did for the French was the deadly combination of Wellington and the guerrillas, and the key element was the guerrillas. This is a fact notoriously overlooked by British historians who treat the war solely as a series of set pieces between Wellington and Napoleon's marshals. The French were strong enough to occupy the main towns and strategic centers, and thus contain the guerrillas provided they did not also have to fight Wellington. But the British were merely the necessary conditions for Spanish defeat. The guerrillas provided the sufficient conditions. The more intelligent French commanders saw that the requirements of military occupation in a hostile country contradicted the requirements for active campaigning. An exhausted Bessières wrote in I8II, "If I concentrate Z0000 men, all my communications are lost and the insurgents make great progress. We occupy too much territory." Jourdan agreed that the military occupation of Spain was not feasible, and that any number of French set-piece victories would make no difference. The only solution was to hold a line north of Madrid. Guerrilla warfare meant constant threats to an already tenuous supply line, and the threat of starvation. Massena was fond of quoting an old saying attributed to Henry Q. Iater, "Spain is a country where small armies are defeated and large armies starve." Another marshal, Marmont, wrote despondently in I8IZ, "The English army had its pay on time, the French army received not a penny. The English army had magazines in abundance, and the English soldier never needed to forage for himself. The French army lived only by the efforts of those who comprised it. The English army had 6,000 mules for its food supplies alone. The French army had no other means of transport but the backs of our soldiers." This was the hidden subtext of Wellington's eventual triumph, which has been portrayed too often solely in terms of his peerless military talent. Supplied by sea by the Royal Navy, he could maneuver in Spain when and where he wished. The French troops had no regular supply and were too numerous to live off the land. foraging parties, unless in brigade strength, would be taken out by the guerrillas, while a wholesale effort to supply the army FRPM France would mean that Napoleon had no resources left over for adventures elsewhere in Europe. Since the guerrillas were the rock on which Napoleon's Spanish adventure foundered, they merit more attention than they have received in most histories of the Peninsular War. Who were they, what were their aims, and why were they so successful? Unfortunately, historians disagree on almost every aspect of the Spanish irregulars. Some say there were as many as S0000, others that the figure may be as low as 30,000 in contrast to an English army of 40,000 and 25,000 Spanish regulars. As for the casualties they inflicted, this too divides commentators. Although we may discount King Joseph's figure of 180,000 guerrilla-caused deaths out of a total French mortality of 240,000 in the years 1808–1813, as being absurdly high, some scholars opt for a high of 145,000. Others claim that many deaths through wounds and disease were attributed to the guerrillas, so that the true figure is in the region of 76,000 deaths. But at the very least the guerrillas must have accounted for 30 French deaths every day. Another problem is that the Spanish guerrillas have been hopelessly romanticized as freedom fighters. There were a few idealists, but mostly they were old-style bandit chiefs whose activities were legitimated by the struggle for Ferdinand, the desired one. Spanish guerrilla warfare was overwhelmingly a rural affair, with undertones of social war, poor against rich, but it always tended to shade into tax-resistant brigandage. It was in almost every respect a retrograde and reactionary phenomenon which, with its ethos of partisan warfare, the cult of the leader, xenophobia and mindless hatred and atrocity, left Spain a baneful legacy which some say would eventually surface in the Spanish Civil War of 1936–39. By encouraging contempt for social norms, it encouraged Spaniards to live outside the law and accept the doctrine that power comes out of the barrel of a gun. By romanticizing revolution, glorifying insubordination and deifying violence and atrocity, it laid the foundations for a sea of troubles in later Spanish history. No service is done to history by endorsing the legend of the Spanish guerrilla patriots, but of their power of attrition there can be no doubt. Although difficult to use strategically in planned campaigns, they were invaluable in preventing French armies appearing in overwhelming force. If the French did not occupy territory effectively, it fell into the hands of partisans, leaving the French the task of cleansing the area with inadequate numbers and defective maps. They attacked regular troops only when in overwhelming numbers and largely restricted themselves to occupying areas evacuated by the enemy. But they struck terror into French soldier and afrancisados alike. Known never to take prisoners, they practiced with gusto the arts of crucifixion, garroting, boiling in oil and burning at the stake. In addition to the luckless 100,000 French troops who died at their hands, another 30,000 Spaniards suspected of collaboration were put to death in extremes of cruelty. Sometimes entire villages were wiped out. The very geography of Spain favored the partisans and worked against the French. The principal mountain ranges, Pyrenees, Cantabrians, Guadaramas, the Sierra de Guadalupe, de Toledo and the Sierra Morna, run east to west, as do the rivers Ebro, Douro, Tagus, Guadiana, Guadalquivir. Guerrilla movement was easier that way, but the French needed good north-south communications to be supplied effectively. In their mountain fastnesses the guerrilla leaders ruled bands of warriors that could number anything from a few dozen to 8,000, as in the case of Francisco Espoz y Mina. Active in Navarre and the most famous of the guerrillas, Mina was an authoritarian peasant responsible for many of the worst atrocities. Other names that became familiar to French commanders were Juan Paleria, El Medico, who operated over a wide area from La Mancha to Toledo, and often menaced the environs of Madrid, Juan Diaz, El Empecinado, who was active in Castile and boasted that he never lost a man in action, and Juan Diaz Porlier, estimated to have commanded 4,000 men by 1800 and particularly associated with Galicia and the Asturias. Bloodthirsty, ruthless and cruel men, they were, like sharks, not averse to devouring each other if French victims were lacking. Mina fought a campaign in 1810 against another bandit leader, Echeverria. Haughty and indisciplined, they disregarded any orders from the courts or the junta or Wellington that clashed with their own interests, and were thus a perfect analogue for Napoleon's marshals in Spain. That the French held their own for so long, faced with a hostile population and desperate enemies, was largely because they enjoyed the support of local quislings or afrancisados. These pro-French collaborators have divided historians as strongly as the guerrillas. Some view them as naive idealists, who believe that collaboration with Joseph was the way to preserve Spanish independence and annexation by Napoleon, or who genuinely thought that Napoleon was the bringer of reform and enlightenment. Others take a more jaundiced view of the afrancisados as opportunists who, at least until Rate R2, thought that Napoleon was invincible, or see them as a mixture of cynicism an inertia wedded to a simple desire for salaries, places, and privilege. In many cases, the question of to be or not to be a French collaborator was settled by geography, almost on the old principle of cuius regio, ius religio, yet another link between our 808 and the Civil War of 1936. There is some evidence that Napoleon occasionally tried to pull out of the Spanish maelstrom, but each time he took a faltering step, circumstances worked against him. By the end of R809 he seemed to have become convinced that installing Joseph as King of Spain had been a mistake and that the best strategy was restoration of Ferdinand, provided he would agree to make common cause against England. While Joseph fortified himself with the illusion that he could conciliate the Spanish by reforms, a gentle forbearing rule and a show of independence from the emperor, Napoleon decided to apply pressure on him. An imperial decree of the 8th of February Rate seemed like the prelude to yet another annexation. By the decree, Napoleon lopped off a huge area of northern Spain from Joseph's domains and organized 4 independent military governments, Catalonia, Aragon, Navarre and Guipuscoa, under direct French control. Naturally piqued, Joseph talked of abdication, which is exactly what his brother wanted. But in the end he decided not to abdicate, leaving Napoleon with the straight choice of dismissing him or sustaining him. The only way the emperor could have winkled the firstborn of the Bonapartes out of Spain was by allowing him to return to his old kingdom in Naples, but this was politically impossible as it would mean ousting the Murats. In April Napoleon gave the command of the army of Portugal to Messina, but it was September that year before the marshal commenced a tortuous march on Lisbon with a 70,000-strong army. By this time Wellington had an army of S0000, even though he could normally put only about 2/3 of this in the field because of garrison and other duties. But he had used the lull in fighting to good effect by planning and constructing the lines of Torres Vedras, a set of fortifications from the Atlantic to the Tagus, straddling the neck of land around Lisbon. Beginning in late R809, Wellington built 2 fortified lines to defend Lisbon. The work was completed in the summer of Rate. The first line was 29 miles long and ran from the coast to the Tagus at Alhandra. The second, 6 miles to the south and supposedly impregnable, stretched 22 miles from the coast to the Tagus, roughly parallel with the first line. These lines were a melange of strong points, artillery positions, trenches, redoubts, ditches and palisades. The ground in front of the lines was cleared of all cover and a set of redoubts at the end of the second line gave crossfire with Admiral Berkeley's gunboats on the river. There was even a third line of fortifications at the mouth of the Tagus, designed to enable the army to embark safely in the event of a disaster. In September I-8 Messina struck into Portugal and gained some initial success. At first Wellington retreated, then stood his ground at Busaco near Coimbra on the 25th of September. Bringing his strength up to S0000 by Herculean efforts, he posted them on a ridge, then lured Messina to attack by disguising his numbers. In a frontal assault on the ridge lasting 3 hours, the French were badly beaten, taking 4,600 casualties against Wellington's 200. In October Wellington withdrew behind the lines of Torres Vedras. Messina, coming up behind him, probed and concluded that an attack on the lines would be suicidal. The resulting stalemate until March I saw Messina's army wasting away through sickness and starvation. Foraging was impossible because the British had implemented a scorched earth policy, and any attempt to revictual the army had to run the gauntlet of Spanish and Portuguese guerrillas. In desperation, Messina finally pulled out of Portugal altogether, leaving behind thousands of non-battle casualties. He made a vain attempt to re-enter Portugal, which aborted because of opposition from 2 subsidiary marshals. Soult, who hated him, was supposed to coordinate a pincer movement from Seville and Badajoz but failed to do so. Then Messina quarreled violently with Ney and sent him back to France in disgrace. While Messina was thus preoccupied around Salamanca, Wellington emerged to besiege Almeida. Factionalism among the marshals, some of whom had been effectively turned into independent warlords by Napoleon's I-8 decree, was proving to be almost as much a headache for the French as the guerrillas. Despairing of cooperation from Soult, Messina approached Bessières, now commanding the Army of the North, for reinforcements with which to relieve Almeida. The cynical Bessières sent him just $1 men. Pressing on nonetheless, the intrepid Messina was surprised by Wellington at Fuentes de Ofero but nearly managed to turn the tables on him. Wellington won a hard-fought battle but admitted, "If Boney had been there, we would have been damnably licked." Messina withdrew to Ciudad Rodrigo and claimed a victory. Napoleon, however, was not deceived and a week later recalled him to France, appointing Marmont in his stead. Napoleon, though, owed Messina a favor after an incident at an imperial shooting party at Fontainebleau in September R808. The emperor, a famously bad shot, hit Messina in the face with a bullet when aiming at a bird and destroyed the sight in his left eye. Massena had done his best in Spain, and Wellington testified that he could never rest easy while the one-eyed marshal was in the field. Marmont was scarcely an improvement. Destined to be the least successful of all the peninsular marshals, he was a man of no military talent who owed his elevation to the marshallate entirely to Napoleon's favor and repaid him with treachery. The two most talented peninsular marshals were Suchet and Mortier, who, alone of his kind, managed to get on with Soult. This was in marked contrast to another marshal, Victor, who all but refused to serve under the rapacious Soult. But Victor was almost the quintessence of the marshallate in that, after the death of his one friend, Lannes, he declined to take orders from anyone but the emperor. Before Wellington and Marmont could cross swords, Soult had at last blundered into action in the south. He came up to relieve Badajoz, then under siege by General Beresford, forcing the English commander to break off and deal with the threat to his rear. The resulting battle at Albufeira on the 15th of May was the bloodiest in the Peninsular War, with both commanders losing control of their forces. The nerve of the British infantry held better, so that it was Soult who finally disengaged. Casualties were terrific. There were 4,000 fatalities among the 7,600 British casualties, and Spanish and Portuguese losses topped 2,400. Besides, the French sustained total losses of 7,000. Since Beresford had begun the battle with 32,000 against Soult's 23,000, it was disingenuous of the British to claim a great victory. At the very best it was Pyrrhic. Wellington's strategy was to take the fortress towns of Badajoz and Ciudad Rodrigo in order to be able to advance securely into Spain, but the junction of Marmont's and Soult's forces forced him to break off the siege of Badajoz. Another stalemate ensued as both sides eyed each other warily. With just 60,000 men, the French did not feel confident enough to attack Wellington with his S-0000. Soon the unified French command disintegrated. As the familiar jealousies and vociferous tendencies among the marshals took their toll, Soult marched away to Seville while Marmont withdrew to the Tagus Valley. Marmont and Wellington continued to play cat and mouse. The British commander again moved out to threaten Salamanca, whereupon Marmont summoned 4 divisions from the Army of the North, giving him 60,000 men once more. At this, Wellington once more withdrew into the Portuguese mountains. The year 181 was one of mixed fortunes in the peninsula. On the one hand, Wellington had clearly asserted his military supremacy over the French commanders by demonstrating how the massed French columns could be defeated. His favorite device was to keep the bulk of his troops concealed behind reverse slopes so that enemy artillery and skirmishers could not get at them. This upset the calculations of French commanders, who would keep their troops in column until reaching the brow of the defended hill, by which time it was too late to deploy. Raking volleys from the British, sometimes from 3 sides at once, would obliterate the head of the column and send survivors reeling back in confusion. Had Napoleon taken the trouble to study the Spanish battles closely instead of railing formulaically at his marshals for incompetence, he would have seen that the fluidity, speed, mobility and sheer aggression of the French column, which had overwhelmed opponent after opponent for 10 years, was beginning to fail, and that his battle tactics should be rethought. Wellington, meanwhile, though never the military genius his supporters claim, went from strength to strength. A thorough knowledge of his enemy's methods meant that he was never psychologically unhinged or beaten before he began, as were so many Allied commanders facing French marshals. His remarkably effective methods were in fact as predictable as Napoleon's came to be. Everything depended on an eye for terrain and a clever choice of battlefield, which allowed him to use his favorite method of concealing men behind reverse slopes, using riflemen to dominate no man's land. Time and again the peninsular marshals fell into the trap of sending their men to the summit of a ridge, only to be met by the massed volleys of the long red wall, followed by the much-feared British bayonet charge. If Wellington as a battle commander was predictable, his real claim to a place in the universal military pantheon lay in his mastery of logistics. The way he organized 5 invasion routes between Portugal and Spain, ensuring a continuous commissariat system, was masterly. His threefold supply line, by barge from Lisbon to intermediate depots, by ox wagon convoys to forward supply depots, and thence by divisional and regimental mule trains to the individual units at the front, was an object lesson in how to organize a military campaign. As the great historian of the Peninsular War, Sir John Fortescue, remarked, Wellington's supplies were always hunting for his army, Joseph's army was always hunting for his supplies. For all Wellington's talents, the British position in Spain was far from secure. By the end of I-8-IO, London was increasingly pessimistic about the prospects of being able to stay in the Iberian Peninsula in force, and toyed instead with the idea of converting Cadiz into a second Gibraltar, making it a heavily garrisoned enclave which would command the trade of Latin America. The problem was money. London had gambled its sterling reserves on a quick victory, but the gamble failed, and thereafter the problem loomed: how to get specie to Wellington. He needed ready cash precisely because he was in a friendly country, and therefore could not live off the land. but this was at a time when the Bank of England's hard currency reserves were draining away. They sank from £6.4 million in I-808 to £2.2 million in I-8I4. The British were forced into increasingly desperate measures to obtain bullion from India, China and Mexico. Wellington, who did not understand economics, began to complain vociferously to London about sabotage and spoke in a quasi-paranoid way of deliberate treachery. These complaints reached a peak in I-8IR, but he had not grasped the scale of the problem. To keep an army overseas was the most expensive option London could exercise. The costs of the navy were far less, for sailors were virtually prisoners of war inside their wooden world and, on leaving the ships, were paid off in a British port. Maintaining an army in Spain cost 3 times that of maintaining the same army in Britain, for in the United Kingdom suppliers did not demand payment in bullion and troops could be paid in paper money. The financial drain of the Peninsular War did not end there. In I-8II, 60% of grain imports from the USA went to the peninsula. As far as possible, the British tried to victual Wellington's army from the homeland. In I-808, 4 million pounds of beef, 2.5 million pounds of pork, 3 million pounds of flour, 7 million pounds of bread and 336,000 gallons of spirit were sent out. By I-8I3, the average daily consumption in Wellington's army was I-0 pounds of biscuit, 200,000 pounds of forage corn and 300 cattle. At Lisbon there was always a 7 months food supply. But to meet local expenses and Spanish demands to be paid in silver, Britain became a major arms dealer. By I-8II, a total of 336,000 muskets, 60 million cartridges, 348 pieces of artillery, I-0 swords and I-20 pistols had been exported to Spain, and by I-8I3 the British began diversifying in the market for arms in Russia, Prussia, Austria and Sweden. Nonetheless, for a while the financial fate of Wellington's expeditionary force hung in the balance. By I-8I2 London could not meet his pay bills, troops had not been paid for 5 months and muleteers for 13, and the inevitable result was looting and alienation of the local population. London was reduced to borrowing cash from shady Maltese and Italian bankers at outrageously usurious rates in exchange for bills drawing on the British government. The breakthrough was achieved in Rate RZ by the Rothschilds. First, Jacob Rothschild bought up many of these bills at a fraction of their price and took them to London, where his brother Nathan cashed them at the Bank of England at a huge profit. Then Nathan obtained £800,000 in gold from the East India Company, sold it on to the British government for Wellington's use, and even worked out how to get it to Portugal. Yet it was really Napoleon who won the Peninsular War for the British at the very moment fortunes were equally poised, and there was some evidence that London was losing heart. Making a disastrous and ill-judged intervention in Spanish affairs, he ordered Marmont to transfer R0000 men to Suchet's army in Valencia and Catalonia. This left Marmont at Salamanca inferior in numbers to Wellington at the very time the increasing size of the guerrilla bands meant that by the end of Rate RR the French could never muster an army of more than 70,000 to deal with Wellington. It was this that finally allowed the British army to take the offensive and remain there. Napoleon's mistakes in Spain were legion. A wiser man would have pulled out as soon as he saw the depth of the opposition, or at least held a defensive line north of Madrid, possibly from Mediterranean to Atlantic on a Catalonia-Galicia axis. As it was, the emperor seemed woefully ignorant of the real problems of campaigning in the peninsula. He provided insufficient resources to achieve total pacification. Admittedly, this would probably have entailed committing most of the Grand Army to this one theater, closed his eyes and ears to the truth, continued his ludicrous underestimation of Wellington and the British, and seemed almost willful in his refusal to make a close study of the politics and culture of Spain. Until Rate RZ he directed operations from Paris, invariably making the wrong decisions. The most egregious of his errors was his failure to appoint a commander-in-chief in Spain until Rate RZ. The disastrous decision to hive off 4 accepted areas and give them to the marshals, a cynical short-term decision to palliate the unpopularity of Spanish campaigning, allowed the bickering marshals to become, in effect, autonomous warlords, and the consequent lack of central control from Madrid in turn aided Wellington and the guerrillas. Spain thus became what one observer has described as a training ground in disobedience for the marshals. When Napoleon finally did the right thing and appointed Joseph as commander-in-chief in Spain, the 4 martial warlords simply ignored his directives. Elsewhere, the emperor never allowed the feuding of the marshals to interfere with military efficiency and endanger operations, but in Spain he condoned a situation where the jealous baton-toting prima donnas often refused to cooperate with each other. Napoleon compounded his mistake in allowing the marshals a free rein by assigning some of the most rapacious of them to Spain. The one success story was Suchet in Catalonia, but this was because of his lack of rapacity. Where Soult and Messina pillaged and looted high and low in their crazed quest for booty and ill-gotten gains, Soult indeed in his barely disguised ambition for the Spanish crown came close to treason. Suchet governed Catalonia benevolently, prevented looting and did not use the province as a mere milch cow. The result was that he won considerable acceptance and support in the province, and was never defeated in battle. Even here, Napoleon could not let well enough alone, for he prevented Suchet consolidating his grip on Aragon by ordering him to conquer Valencia. Having completed the conquest of Catalonia in 181, Suchet received his marshal's baton, but not before his champion at court, Duroc, explained to the emperor that the few setbacks he sustained were all the fault of Joseph's incompetence. But the greatest of all Napoleon's errors in Spain was his loyalty to Joseph. Even when he finally saw sense and realized that the solution in Spain was Joseph's abdication and the restoration of Ferdinand, his brother managed to talk him round after a long interview when the King of Spain went to France to plead his case in person. For Frederick Masson, it was in Spain above all that Napoleon showed himself as the victim of the family sense, of the Corsican spirit, or primogeniture. Others, surely with justification, speak of a brother complex, making Napoleon absurdly weak when it came to Joseph. On St. Helena he saw the truth when he told Las Cases, "I believe that had I been willing to sacrifice Joseph, I would have succeeded." It would not be fair to conclude on Napoleon's mistakes in Spain without mentioning an alternative view of Napoleon's involvement there, which is that he was better informed than he seemed to be but was enthralled to a domino effect of his own imagination. According to this jigsaw puzzle view of the Napoleonic schema, the emperor's credibility in Spain was on the line in a more systematic sense. Napoleon had always had a tendency to invade country X because his thoughts were really on country Y. So, for instance, Holland had to be invaded to secure Belgium, Germany to secure the Rhine, Naples and Rome to safeguard Piedmont, and Lombardy, and so on. According to this view, the invasion of Spain was supposed to overawe Austria, but, when it signally failed to do so in 1809, Napoleon was involved in a game of double or quits to show that he was irresistible anywhere in Europe. A variant of this view is that if he withdrew anywhere in Europe, he would then be under pressure to withdraw elsewhere. So if he pulled out of Spain, the cry would go up for him to quit Poland. If he quit Poland, he would then come under pressure to relinquish Prussia, then Holland, then Belgium, until in the end he was back with the frontiers of 1792. This is ingenious but offends against Occam's razor. The simple truth is that Napoleon thought he could close the last open door in the continental system against England by a walkover campaign in the Iberian Peninsula, and when this proved illusory, lacked the mental concentration needed to get out. To humiliate Joseph, discipline the marshals and accept the military logic of an unwinnable military campaign would have been a tall order at the best of times. From 1810 onwards, Napoleon's mind was no longer primarily on Spain, for he had found a new interest and a new wife.